he thinks that I'm doing this because I feel like we're not gonna last. And that's not what the issue is.
Debbie is sitting across from Rasit with proof already in her hand, and the most uncomfortable part is that he still does not know exactly how much she knows, because while Rasit seems prepared to explain away one small contradiction, Debbie has quietly spent days connecting dates, messages, and conversations that tell a completely different story. She does not raise her voice, she does not make a dramatic accusation, and she does not even show him the screenshot immediately, because she wants to hear his version one more time before she reveals what has already been confirmed. That decision turns what could have been another relationship argument into something much more serious, because Rasit is about to get several opportunities to tell Debbie the truth, and every time he chooses a different explanation, the situation becomes harder for him to defend. Debbie starts with a question that sounds almost harmless, asking Rasit when he first learned that his plans might have to change, and Rasit answers quickly enough that it almost feels rehearsed. He tells her it happened recently, that he did not know anything for certain before then, and that he did not want to worry her over something that might never become important. Debbie listens without interrupting him, but the expression on her face tells us she is not hearing this information for the first time. She already has a date in mind, and that date is much earlier than the one Rasit just gave her. What makes this moment interesting is that Debbie is not trying to catch him using complicated questions. She is giving him the easiest possible opportunity to tell the same story he has already told somebody else. Then Debbie finally asks the question Rasit was hoping she would never make specific, because she brings up a conversation he previously described as casual and unimportant. Rasit immediately changes the way he talks about it, saying that yes, there was technically a conversation, but nothing was decided and nothing serious was discussed. That answer creates the first real problem, because Rasit is no longer saying the conversation meant nothing. Now he is saying it happened but should not count. Debbie notices that difference immediately, and instead of arguing over the details, she asks him why he never told her about it. Rasit pauses before answering, and that pause says more than the explanation that follows, because for the first time he realizes Debbie may not be working from suspicion anymore. She may be working from information. Rasit tries to bring the conversation back under control by telling Debbie that relationships become impossible when every small detail gets treated like evidence, and under normal circumstances that would actually be a fair point. Couples do not report every passing doubt, every private conversation, or every moment when they feel uncertain, but that is not what Debbie is questioning anymore. Her issue is that Rasit had repeatedly given her a very specific version of events, and the new information changes that version completely. Rasit keeps defending himself by focusing on what he technically did or did not say, while Debbie keeps returning to what he allowed her to believe. That distinction becomes the center of the entire confrontation, because Rasit seems convinced that silence is different from lying, while Debbie believes silence becomes deception when the missing information changes someone else's decisions. The story Rasit originally gave Debbie was simple enough to trust, because he had presented his uncertainty as something that appeared late in the relationship, almost like an unexpected problem that surprised him just as much as it surprised her. According to that version, Rasit had been moving forward confidently until circumstances forced him to reconsider a few things, and Debbie believed him because she had no obvious reason not to. She had been making plans based on the idea that both of them were standing in roughly the same place emotionally. What she did not know was that Rasit may have been questioning those plans much earlier, and if that timeline is true, then several conversations Debbie remembers as reassurance suddenly look very different. The words may have been real in the moment, but the information behind them was incomplete. Debbie asks Rasit whether he remembers telling her that there was never any serious discussion about changing his plans, and Rasit says he remembers, but then he carefully adds that his definition of serious may not be the same as hers. That is where the conversation begins slipping away from him, because every answer suddenly comes with a qualification. First, the conversation did not matter. Then it happened but was not serious, and now the definition of serious itself is being debated. Debbie does not need to call this out aggressively, because the progression is obvious enough on its own. She simply watches him keep moving the line, and the calmer she becomes, the more uncomfortable Rasit looks, because he can no longer tell which part of his story she is actually testing. What Rasit does not know yet is that Debbie did not confront him the moment she became suspicious. She waited, and during that time she started comparing what he had told her at different points in their relationship. She looked at when he claimed he first became uncertain, when he said the important conversation happened, and who he claimed initiated it. Each detail seemed small when viewed alone, but together they created a timeline that did not make sense. According to Rasit, he did not know there was a serious problem until after a particular date, Yet Debbie had information suggesting he discussed that exact problem before that date. According to Rasit, somebody else approached him with the subject, yet another version suggested Rasit was the person who raised it first. That matters because Debbie is no longer investigating one forgotten conversation. She is trying to understand whether Rasit has been adjusting a story, depending on who is listening. She does not want that conclusion to be true, which is probably why she checks the timeline more than once before confronting him. There is a difference between looking for a reason to leave somebody and looking for a reason to keep believing them, and Debbie appears to be doing the second one. She wants to find some explanation that allows all of these statements to exist together without turning Rasit into someone she can no longer trust. The problem is that every new detail is making that explanation harder to find, and Razit's reaction when she becomes specific is not helping him. Debbie finally tells Rasit that she has already spoken with someone who knew about the conversation, but she does not immediately reveal who that person is, or everything they said. Razit's face changes before his words do, because he starts asking questions instead of giving answers. He wants to know who Debbie talked to, what exactly they told her, and why she would believe somebody else over him. Debbie refuses to identify the person yet, telling Rasit that the name should not matter if his story is true. That response puts Rasit in a difficult position, because he now has to decide whether to keep denying details without knowing what Debbie can prove. Suddenly his confidence disappears, and instead of saying the conversation never happened the way Debbie describes, he begins explaining why he might have needed to have it. That transition is important because denial has quietly become justification. Rasit tells Debbie that he was under pressure at the time, that he was overwhelmed by everything changing around him, and that speaking privately about different possibilities did not mean he had stopped caring about her. On its own, that explanation actually sounds reasonable because people can love someone while still feeling afraid about the future. Debbie even acknowledges that part, telling Rasit that uncertainty is not the issue. She could have handled uncertainty, and she could have handled hearing that he needed more time, but she cannot understand why Rasit apparently discussed those doubts with somebody else while continuing to give her the impression that everything between them was settled. Then the conversation reaches the first major reveal, because Debbie says she knows Rasit did more than simply express uncertainty. He made a promise during that private conversation, and according to what Debbie has learned, that promise gave another person the impression that Razit's future was still open. Rasit immediately tries to reduce the importance of the wording, saying that people say things when they are stressed and that he never made a final commitment to anyone else. Debbie is not claiming that he did. Her point is much simpler and much harder for him to answer. While Rasit was telling Debbie their path forward was secure, he was apparently telling somebody else that he had not completely decided what that path would be. That is the moment Debbie's hurt becomes more visible than her anger, because this is no longer about finding one suspicious message on a phone. If Rasit really left himself an escape route while Debbie believed they were moving forward together, then she was making emotional decisions with less information than he had. Rasit tries to reassure her by saying that none of those doubts matter now because he eventually chose to stay committed to her, and from his perspective, that final decision should be the part that counts. Debbie sees it differently, because she believes the process matters just as much as the final answer. If one person is deciding whether the relationship will continue, while the other person thinks that decision has already been made, then they're not actually making the same choice together. Rasit insists that he never wanted to hurt her and that he kept his uncertainty private precisely because he did not want to create unnecessary panic. This is probably the first part of his defense that Debbie can emotionally understand, because fear does make people delay difficult conversations, especially when they believe the situation might resolve itself. However, Debbie points out the problem with that logic. Rasit protected himself from an uncomfortable conversation by allowing her to feel secure in something he privately questioned. He may have told himself he was protecting Debbie, but he was also protecting himself from the consequences of honesty. That does not automatically mean every feeling Rasit expressed was fake, but it does mean Debbie was not given the chance to react to the same reality Rasit was living in. Debbie then asks him directly whether there is anything else she should know, and Rasit answers no almost immediately. He tells her she now understands everything. There were no other promises, no other secret decisions, and nothing else that would change the meaning of what happened. Debbie does not respond right away, and the silence becomes uncomfortable because she clearly expected that answer. She looks down at the information in front of her and asks Rasit whether he is absolutely sure. Instead of reconsidering, Rasit doubles down and tells her yes, which is exactly what Debbie needed him to do, because she has not shown him the second contradiction yet. Rasit thinks he has finally reached the end of the confrontation, but Debbie is actually about to restart it with a completely different conversation. She asks Rasit about a specific day when he supposedly spoke with another person, and Razit's first reaction is to say he does not remember anything important happening that day. Debbie adds one more detail, reminding him where he was and what was happening around that time, and suddenly Razit's memory improves. He says there may have been a brief conversation, but he still does not remember discussing anything serious. Debbie then mentions the subject of the conversation, and Rasit shifts again, acknowledging that yes, they may have discussed it, but not in the way she is describing. This progression becomes impossible to ignore because we have moved from not remembering to remembering a conversation, to remembering the subject, and every new memory appears only after Debbie provides another piece of information. Debbie finally tells Rasit that this is exactly what has been bothering her. She does not expect him to remember every sentence he has ever spoken, but every uncomfortable truth seems to appear only after she proves she already knows part of it. Rasit becomes frustrated and accuses her of turning their relationship into an interrogation where nothing he says will ever be enough. He argues that Debbie has already decided he is guilty and is simply asking questions until she gets the answer she wants. Debbie responds that if she had already decided everything, she would not have given him repeated opportunities to tell her first. What she wanted was not a perfect explanation. She wanted to see whether Rasit would volunteer information when he had no idea what she could verify. That is where Rasit finally admits there is another detail, but even the admission comes wrapped in a defense. He tells Debbie he was planning to tell her eventually, when the timing was better and when he understood his own feelings clearly enough to explain them. That sentence changes the entire mood of the conversation because Debbie realizes Rasit was not simply forgetting to tell her something. He had consciously decided there would be a future moment when she would be allowed to know. Debbie asks him who decided when the time would be right, and Rasit has no satisfying answer because the obvious answer is Rasit himself. He was controlling both the information and the timing while Debbie continued making choices based on the version he had already given her. Rasit begins explaining that his doubts went back further than Debbie realizes, and this becomes the confession she had been waiting for, even though hearing it clearly hurts more than she expected. He tells her there was a period when he genuinely did not know whether their relationship could survive everything surrounding them, and during that period, he considered an alternative future. He insists that considering another path does not mean his feelings for Debbie were false, because both things could exist at the same time. He could love Debbie and still question whether love would be enough to make their future work. That part is emotionally believable, but Debbie's problem is that Rasit was having that internal debate while outwardly giving her confidence that the debate had already ended. Debbie asks how long those doubts lasted, and Razit's answer pushes the timeline further back than she expected. Suddenly, several older moments take on a completely different meaning. Conversations Debbie remembers as reassurance now happen during a period when Rasit says he was still uncertain, which immediately makes her wonder what else she misunderstood. She asks whether he meant the things he told her during that time, and Rasit becomes visibly frustrated because he thinks she is turning uncertainty into proof that every affectionate moment was dishonest. He tells her that feelings do not disappear just because someone is scared, and he has a point there, but Debbie is asking something slightly different. She is asking whether reassurance still counts as honesty when the person giving it intentionally leaves out doubts that might change how the other person responds. Then Debbie asks the question Rasit cannot escape with wording, because she looks at him and asks whether he ever would have told her any of this if she had not discovered the inconsistencies herself. Rasit begins to answer, stops, and looks away. He could easily say yes, and that is probably the answer Debbie desperately wants to hear, but for once he does not immediately choose the safest response. After a long hesitation, he admits that he does not know. That answer hurts Debbie, but it may also be the first completely direct answer he has given her during the entire confrontation. He does not know whether he would have told her, because he had already spent so much time convincing himself that the past no longer mattered once he finally chose their relationship. For a moment, it seems like that confession might actually become the turning point, because Debbie finally hears Rasit speak without trying to win the argument. He admits that he was scared, admits that he avoided information because he feared what Debbie might do with it, and admits that keeping everything separated felt easier than risking the relationship. Debbie softens slightly because fear is something she can understand, even when she does not approve of how he handled it. Rasit explains that every time he thought about telling her, he convinced himself there was no reason to reopen an old uncertainty that had already been resolved. In his mind, bringing it up would only hurt Debbie over a decision he no longer intended to make. That explanation almost works because it finally gives Razit's behavior an emotional logic instead of another technical defense. The problem is that Debbie still has one person sitting in the middle of the timeline, and that person's account includes a detail Rasit has not admitted yet. Debbie reveals that the person she contacted remembers Rasit specifically asking that certain parts of their conversation stay private. Rasit immediately says the request was not meant to deceive Debbie. He simply wanted to avoid gossip and unnecessary interference while he worked out what he wanted. Debbie does not argue about whether Rasit wanted gossip. She asks why a completely harmless conversation required secrecy from the one person most affected by the decision being discussed. Rasit says because he needed space to think without losing everything before he understood what he wanted, and that sentence finally exposes the real motive underneath all the smaller explanations. Rasit wanted time to decide, but he also wanted Debbie to remain emotionally committed while he made that decision. He did not necessarily want to humiliate her, replace her, or deliberately cause pain, but he wanted the security of knowing Debbie was still there while he kept his own uncertainty private. Debbie becomes quieter after hearing that because this explanation is more painful than the hidden conversation itself. The problem was never just that Rasit had doubts. It was that he gave himself the freedom to doubt while protecting himself from the possibility that Debbie might respond by having doubts of her own.